Hey everybody. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started on module 2. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Maybe. All right. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 4, but we're also going to go over 3 chapters in your textbook. We're going to go over 2 chapters in the Being Indigenous text, and then 1 chapter in the Brown Enough text. All right. So let's start here with chapter 4. So really this chapter was regarding sociological theories of race. It's going to talk about a lot of key terms that we're really going to be continuing to talk about as we move forward in this course and why they're so important. I am not going to ask you really who gave you what particular term or things of that nature. And the majority of the reason for that is, well, your textbook gives specific people who gave a specific definition, and those are the ones that I use in here. There have been people talking about these particular ideas for an extended period of time. So limiting that those ideas to a specific person and in that way kind of negates especially Black feminist sociologists and scholars in general who have been talking about a lot of these things for very extended periods of time. So let's go ahead and get in here and we're going to just jump right in. The idea behind a sociological theory is that it is some form of essentially educated answer to a social situation based on gathered data, whether that be observations, whether that be surveys, whether that be any of those methods that we use in sociology to gather data. We acquire a whole bunch of data about a topic, and then we essentially, using that evidence, develop explanations for why a phenomenon is happening in society, right? And specific to race, we talk about how racism works, how people are racialized into categories, how our society operates given these categories, and the implicit biases that are made and or are perpetuated with these within these categories, and for those who are creating the categories, and kind of where those, again, all of that is coming from and why it's happening. All right. We're going to talk about the 4 major I guess, levels of which racism we're going to talk about in this course. Now, each one of these is going to have a wide variety of different things that they cover. So like in individual racism, you're going to see a lot of one-on-one. You're going to talk about hate crimes. You could talk about interpersonal relationships. You could talk about interactionary theories. You could talk about hiring and firing practices, right? And boss, like specific key relationships in society, like boss and subordinate worker, right? So there's all these different kinds of things that are going to go into each one of these categories. This is just kind of the overarching theme of that category. And we'll kind of get into how some of these play out in several different atmospheres. So like we might talk about a topic such as the justice system. And we could talk about individual acts of racism as how a particular judge might treat different humans different ways. Or we could talk about institutionally how racism is built into that due to policies and lawmaking procedures and practices within the judicial system. Then we could talk about systemic, right? And we could take that particular topic and break it down into all of these different groups and levels. And so they work together, they overlap, they represent, some of them represent some of the other things, right? So you're going to see individual racism that represents that which is institutionalized or that in which is systemic in a society. And the main goal of this is to really hammer out what the differences is, so that when we talk about a certain scenario or a certain specific category, we can understand that it happens at multiple levels and in multiple ways. And we can discuss that in a way that when we're talking about how to change that, we aren't just talking about changing one person's singular actions, but we're talking about how that needs to change on a much bigger scope. Okay. Again, individual racism is that individual acts of racial discrimination or bigotry. These are very pervasive. More often than not, we're at a societal point where we've agreed upon hate crimes as being wrong. We've agreed upon social lynchings as being wrong, slavery as being wrong, but we're not past the point in which individual racist acts don't exist, right? So people still use slurs. We're still talking about a lot of racial jokes. We're still talking about a lot of hostilities. We're talking about those who get, I think one of the examples in the books was the doubting of merit in educational spaces, right? So not believing that certain specific demographics could get a good grade on a test, those kind of things. This is when like a group gets exoticized, or like say you're a female from a specific region of the world, you might get stereotyped as a specific type of sexually promiscuous. And that's going to come with, again, this is going to come within those interactionary relationships, right? That's going to come on when one-on-one people are talking, or when you're in a specific group, or you're might be the only person of color that is within a specific social setting, or you might be in a classroom where you're the only person of color. These kinds of things lead to these individualistic interactions, right, between a couple of people that are these acts that we're talking about. We're also going to talk about microaggressions because they fit into this particular level, and microaggressions are something that are extremely prevalent in today's society. And again, this goes along with that colorblind racism idea that we talked about previously. It's that it's the but conversations, right? It's the, well, I mean, I'm not racist, but, and then whatever proceeds out of their mouth is usually going to be either a microaggression or just straight aggression. And those microaggressions are really these daily commonplace insults or racial slights that anyway, they add up and they end up affecting the psychological well-being of people of color. But they also impact social settings, right? So if a person of maybe a higher status starts doing specific ways, it's going to encourage other people within that social setting to continue to act that way. And what it does is create hostile situations and hostile environments for people of color. And we'll get into kind of how some of those play out again in surrounding multiple different topics as we move through the semester. There is something called the Microaggression Project. And if I put the website in here, and that was something that was talked about in your book. And essentially it's just somewhere for people to go to kind of let off or release that valve, that steam valve of the pressure that comes with all of these microaggressions happening to them on a regular basis. And when you read through some of those, you read through maybe one or two of them and it's not so bad. It's, well, you got to let that stuff go. Everybody gets picked on, blah, 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 blah. Or that's kind of, they don't mean that as an insult. And there's all these justifications, right? But those justifications deny the fact and are being used again to legitimize this kind of behavior, while simultaneously telling the person of color that how they feel about it is invalid. And so we want to make sure that we understand that these microaggressions, again, they add up, and they make people feel tired. They make people feel discouraged and angry and self-conscious and delegitimized and disempowered, ostracized. They can lead to very serious things like depression, social anxiety, suicidal ideations. And it's hard to live in a society where your everyday interaction, well, you could go to the grocery store and you might get these. You could go to, you know what I mean? Like it's a constant thing. And that's not to say that there's not situations that people of color are in that don't have these. It's to say that if you are not a person of color, looking for how these are really meant, or how, if you reframe the words to include white person instead of person of color, or you include woman instead of man, or whatever it may be, that these little microaggressions, how those would then impact you if they continue to happen over and over and over again. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is institutionalized racism. And this is really racism that's built into your policies, your laws, your major institutions. So your education system, your judicial system, your government system, your family systems, even your employment systems, right? So like these are the things that at an institutional level have particular ways of doing that impacts how those systems work. And they can happen at a covert or an overt level. So they can be very like over the top. This is what's happening. You can very clearly see that this is what's happening and its cause. Or it can be things again where you're tied into, well, and a lot of times some of the more overt things that some people feel more subvert to others. So that don't necessarily experience it. So being pulled over more often because you're Black, right? Being being arrested for being in the wrong space because you're Black, being, and this is just within one particular judicial system, we can all say, well, they shouldn't have been there. Or people can say, you know, well, you just don't hear about the white people that they pull over. Well, that's because they don't end up dead, right? Like, and there's things here that are at play that at an institutional level, there is a way of being trained that trains you to think that these neighborhoods that are predominantly Black are going to have more crime inherently, that are going to have that are going to need to be surveilled more seriously, that are going to need more serious action, that require you to have a level of fear, so you should go in guns blazing. All of these ideologies and all these legitimizations end up taking away from those overt levels of racism that are happening within the structure, right? So the structure is saying, hey, treat these people this way and these people this way, right? Point blank, that's what's happening. And in doing that, what you get is a whole lot of justifications for the things built into the system, as opposed to changing how that system operates, and then a continuation of those patterns by justifying each one of them with all of the XYZs for why it could have happened, as opposed to, hey, this is the overwhelming trend, all the data is pointing to this, let's address this, right? And that's kind of where some things that feel covert to some people may be very overt to others who experience this on a regular basis. And I gave the example of this particular topic due to the fact that in your book, they talk about police shootings. Black men are 21 more times likely to be killed by the police than white men. And we're going to keep talking about this topic. This is a topic that is, especially with current events, is going to be something that has to be talked about in this class. We're talking about social problems, right? We're talking about race and racism. Then this is inherent to that conversation. And so we're going to have a whole module on the justice system and policing, and we'll get into this more depths. But I do want to also give space for the fact that, and the sad part is, I could say current events now, and this could be watched in 2 years, and they could be sitting in the same place, not thinking that this is a new topic, right? Because it is something that is perpetually being part of our conversations at a societal level right now. It's something that is being brought up. It's being continued. The conversation is still happening. And it's something that if there is space that is needed for those moments, those cultural moments, please don't hesitate to ask for those, because these are very scary things. To think that you could drive your car and not come home that day is something that no mom wants to think about, having to get that phone call, and no person should have to fear going out and being part of society in that way. So we'll keep talking about this again. That is in no way, shape, or form the end of this conversation. But it was a really good way of having a conversation about institutionalization of racist policies. And again, we'll go through several of those when we get to that module. Systemic. So essentially, theorists came up with this institutional level and this individual level first, right? This was conversation saying, hey, it's not just these one-on-one interactions. It's also at this level that is state sponsored. It's at this level that at a governmental level, there's a lack of representation in the way it's needed, and thus policies aren't made for specific groups. They're made to continue the policing of specific groups. Police in general were built to contain, modify, oppress specific racial categories in this country. And again, we'll get into that more. And that legacy and history is built into the institution. And that's why we're going to talk about this. But when people got to really, like, especially sociologists got to really thinking about this institutional level, they really realized that there's multiple things happening here. Okay. There's multiple kinds of racism. And so they broke it down again. And they were really talking about, systemic racism, or this diverse assortment of racist practices that unjustly gained economic and political power of white people and continue resource inequalities, and the white racist ideologies, attitudes, and institutions created to preserve white advantage and power. So this is, again, the systemic is more like, hey, we're going to talk about white supremacy. We're going to talk about patriarchy. We're going to talk about all of these big things that are at like a society-wide conversation, right? And when we talk systemically, we're talking about where history meets individual lives, right? It's where this trend of history has created this power dynamic that is unequal, and that unequal power dynamic, both economically and through political process, has allowed for the continuation of oppression of the people who do not have that power. And that's a system level thing, right? So the fact that a consistency is there for an overrepresentation of white men over the age of 50 in our political process, again, continues to have conversations surrounding who has political power and what they do with it, and how and who they're maintaining that power for. Because it's not going to be people that they aren't like, because they're going to try to keep an overwhelming extent of that power so that they can keep benefiting from it. And that's something that, again, we'll continue talking about. These are going to include those daily microaggressions, deep-seated inequalities, unjust impoverishment, vested interest in maintaining racism, based on routine, discrimination, rationalization of racism, and imbalance of economic and political power. And again, that's the key here. This is about a conversation about political and economic power that recycles itself in order to maintain inequality, to maintain certain oppressions within and amongst people of color, so that white people specifically can maintain their economic wealth, can maintain their economic status, and then can use that economic wealth and status in order to gain and keep political power to then gain more economic status, right? It's a circle and it just keeps going, right? Similar to the capitalist structure as a whole. And because the capitalist structure was built on white male property owners allowing themselves to be extremely wealthy while extreme poverty still existed, that ideology carried forth and allowed for this continuation of systems, oh excuse me, where that power continues, right, where that cycle wants to continue. And so we'll keep talking about that. The last one we're going to talk about is structural racism. And this is a pattern of action in which one or more of the institutions of society has power to throw on more burdens and give less benefits to the members of one race than another in an ongoing basis. Okay, so I want to break this down real quick before I talk more about structural racism. Individual level, those are those one-on-one acts, right? Those are those racial slurs. Those are those things that is one person talking to another person, or a couple people talking to another person, or a group dynamic, right? They're small interactions that have large meaning, but they're still small interactions. Then you have institutions, and institutionalized racism is really where you're going to find all those different policies, procedures, all the things that are written in writing that are going to essentially, and or that are coded into trainings that are representative of certain racist ideologies. Then you go down to systemic. Systemic is going to be those wide overarching ideologies that maintain economic and political power for white people. And then you get into structural, and this is where you're going to see that institutional level working together, right? So an education system that is built on a housing system that is built on economic and social inequality, right? So if you can't get people of color into specific neighborhoods that have the better schools, their education is going to be less, which is going to leave them out of more prosperous economic opportunities, which leads them into less job opportunities, and so on and so forth, right? That's that stair stepping of institutions that then impact that system-wide racism, impact that socioeconomic and political power. These are the institutions and how they work together to keep that. And that's where you're going to find structural. So it's built into the structure, right? That's how you can remember the structural racism. Systemic is its big and overarching ideas of economics and power. Then you have institutionalized, which is where it's written in to those specific institutions. You're going to talk about one specific institution, not the stair steps of the structure, right? One institution. Or individual racism, where it's that one-on-one acts, right? And these can happen within institutions and within the system, right? I hope that makes sense. And I hope I broke that down well enough. If not, this is something to kind of really grasp, and it's something that we'll continue to talk about. So please feel free to come talk to me, okay? A little bit more about structural racism. It's interinstitutionalized interactions across time and space. So these are going to change and vary depending on how interactions are built and what is given importance in society. So, right, there's a point in which in certain societies, church reigns the most important, versus in some societies it might be education, versus some societies it might be the governmental, and some of these institutions, depending on what we're talking about, are going to play more of a role, and we'll get into that. And then it's how do they interact with each other to set up these racial social systems. And then there's also this very big understanding of how suburbanism versus and they talked about Katrina, but this historic transitions from people living in either suburban areas and white people specifically living in suburban areas versus Black people were living in more urban, more ghetto type structured areas. And that's not ghetto being like the slang term, but ghetto is in the like actual structural way in which you describe a specific type of area based on this sociologist. And then that went into, and that is felt into the system of how lending and racial inequality was spread through the housing markets, right? And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier. These are kind of an example. And then when Katrina hit, that put pressure on this system that was already in place, this structural inequality and structural racism. And it left people at an individual level without options. it left them without opportunities, and it left them dying of disease, lack of water, lack of being able to build their house back, lack of being able to go back to work and have jobs. All of these things have a very dramatic impact for individuals. All right, so let's move on a little bit. We're going to talk about racial formation, which is just the socio-historic process by which racial categories are created, inhibited, transformed, and destroyed as a process of historically situated projects. So, right, this is essentially society makes different categories of race. And we talked about this a lot when we talked about that long history lesson, right? So where Irish immigrants fit into that, where Black people fit into that, where people who were of mixed race will fit into that. And we're going to talk about that a little more in one of our other lectures when we get into talking about the census, because it's a really good indicator of what society is kind of thinking when it comes to racial categories. But we'll get into that a little more in that lecture. When we talk about this particular thing, usually society influences the government to some extent, but the government also influences society. But the government is generally where race is constructed and contested. So essentially, legally, at a governmental level, through law, through policy, and through challenges to those things, is where you're going to find the most influential bit of categorization, right? So they're going to figure out who is defined in what way and how to put them into policies accordingly, specifically immigration policies and things of that nature. So when we talk about Indigenous peoples, we're going to talk about racial dynamics in a little bit different way. And that's because there had to be a creation or a category of American Indian in order to even have a conversation about Indigenous peoples to begin with, because that category is a made up fictional category made up by European colonialists who essentially came over with the intent to steal those lands. That was never a racial or a category prior to that meeting up, right? It was just people meeting other people. But when that category was made, it allowed a process for people of a specific demographic that met specific categories to be able to be ostracized in specific ways. So to be shelled off their land, to be sent to assimilation schools, to be taxed in a certain way, to be considered a dual-ish citizen, to be ruled under specific different categories. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But it also is a category that impacts people still currently, because the more we talk about ancestry and the more we get into how ancestors and how people before us mixed and mingled and communicated, we have conversations surrounding how much of something someone has to be to get credit for being that. And it becomes less of a cultural identity and more of a governmental based identity that provides specific kinds of benefits, whatever those are, and specific kinds of consequences, right? So the federal government's going to require a person to have a certain amount of whatever the indigenous ancestry in order to become part of that tribe. However, the tribal governments are going to have different rules and regulations. They may ask you to have a link to someone that is a part of that tribe. They may ask you to provide lineage several years back. They may ask you to know the history of the tribe, or et cetera, et cetera. And that's because at the federal government level, they're trying to figure out a way to base a specific kind of intolerance in a roundabout number versus a tribal organization who's trying to preserve culture and is wanting it to be a cultural conversation surrounding those who are inherently part of it. There's also several terms that the book threw out in this chapter, and I kind of wanted to get at a couple of those just to give you guys some clarification. Racial dictatorship is really state-sponsored white dominance, and we saw this through the massive genocide, through Indian removal acts. We saw this through, continue to see this through the ways in which the government does whatever it wants to with the lands of indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera. You have racial hegemony, which is just the idea that essentially, if you continue to have one particular group that has the most of something, then obviously they're that ideal status, if that makes sense. And or if you promote a specific ideal status so much so that it doesn't matter if it is the majority, it more matters that it is the majority visible, and that then creates its power behind it. And we'll get into that a little more as we move forward. So there was a couple of scholars who really look at how we talk about our racial relations and whether or not we're more in that dictatorship and that words are hard today. Despotism. There we go. Or if we're moving more towards democracy. And right, the case for indigenous relationships with the United States, the allowing of specific features to be more tribal governed, like say the adoption or placing a child when they have entered child welfare of any kind to be up to tribal leadership, right? There's certain categories in which that's getting closer. Or post civil rights movement, you're going to see a little bit more shift to rights towards people and a shift more towards democracy. The problem here is that even with those shifts, there is severe power imbalances economically and socially that still lead us to believe that we're not at that racial democracy as we thought we were, or as people might claim at this point in our history. And remember that when you look at history, this is something that I think gets lost sometimes, but when you look at the history of the United States, we still have far more history in slavery and genocide and number of years where we murdered anyone who wasn't white, who we exhibited extreme amounts of force to anyone that wasn't white to maintain control and dictate exactly how those human bodies were allowed to operate, breathe, eat, sleep, etc. Then we have had years where anyone has had rights. And if you take in and add some of the interim, some of the middle ground, where you still had Jim Crow, where you still didn't where rights to votes weren't still not there, you're overwhelmingly still in a place where the legal rights of humans has been nothing close to democratic more often than it hasn't been in this country. And that's something that I think when we talk about history, because we can say, well, that was a long time ago, it really wasn't in comparison to the length of time that there was still mechanisms in place that was extreme amounts of state-sponsored violence. And we're going to argue throughout this class that there are still measures of state-sponsored violence that will create unequal power dynamics. And then we're going to talk a little bit about racial projects, right? So, and race as a master category. Let's talk about that first. That is just the idea that when we walk through society, that category that most instinctively causes reaction or interaction with others in the societal world or with institutions in the societal world, the one that's going to hit first and with the most oomph is going to be race, right? So we are going to walk through the world as a white person or as a person of color, and then we're going to talk about colorism in between there in a bit. But that category is going to be the one that pops off and is the first judgment, is the first thing that garners how you are treated in this in this society. And that's been argued. Now, others have argued that gender is up there on that list as well. And others have still argued that class is still the primary one. I think regardless of whether it is the primary one or not, it is one that is so easily recognizable and instantaneously impacts interactions that regardless of whether that hits home before gender does or before class does, it is so inherent to how we interact that it is something that we cannot ignore and or maintain that it is not a master category, if that makes sense. All right. Racial projects. Basically, a racial project is anything where you're thinking about, you're trying to discuss, talk about, critique how race relations works or racial dynamics within a society. And these can be good or bad, and they're geared towards change generally, or sometimes geared towards enhancing more oppression, but we'll get at that later. But you might have a racial project, for example, that analyzes whether or not, like, analyzes the level at which certain schools and certain districts are performing, how they're performing, and then categorize the racial makeup of those and really talk about or critique the ways in which performance might be geared towards the kind of school you get into and the resources that you have allotted within that school. And that could tie back to how education is inequitable across the board. And that is going to be a racial project. And that racial project might be geared towards changing that to create more equitable education systems. Right? Or you could use that data and try to say, well, that's because the people at white schools are better than the people at Black schools, right? That's going to get icky, and you're going to have a hard time arguing that with the amount of data that says otherwise. However, that racial project, again, would be considered a negative racial project or something that is and contributes to the continuation of racial inequality. All right, so white supremacy is just a system of racial stratification where it places white people at the top of the hierarchy. And really, they talked about three pillars that are really the most prominent in the United States. And that being anti-Black racism, which is shown throughout our history extensively, all the way from slavery, etc. Genocide, which is really talking about the it's really just talking about our relationship to Indigenous persons, but also that might succeed in becoming a conversation in other ways as we move forward in our history, depending on which direction we go in. And Orientalism, which is that permanent threat of some groups as nations as a constant threat, somebody that might be at war with. So this is going to be any of your individuals from the Middle East. This is going to be anyone from our southern border down. This is going to be generally people from Japan, China, Russia, North Korea, any of these countries that we just consider permanent threats altogether. And so they get lumped into this particular status. And these are essentially the three pillars that justify why people over the course of time have decided that white people have this racial supremacy, and have geared laws and structures and policies and institutions, and even social dynamics at an individual level as such. That does not make it right. Hear my words. I am not promoting white supremacy. What I am saying is that these systems have been put in place because of these three kind of pillars of ideologies, and these three pillars are still very prominent within society. All right, so settler colonialism is really, again, that forced removal, confinement, assimilation, and genocide. I would add sterilization and ecological destruction of indigenous lands to part of that conversation of how in which colonialism continues to impact our relations with other people. The genocide rooting in colonialism, we talked a lot about this in our history lessons, the unique citizenship and capitalistic ownership of the lands of those who work there. And that's again talking about that in conjunction with indigenous persons. And then it's a framework for expelling groups that we pose as a threat to colonial white power. And this is something that I think we're going to have more conversations about when we talk about immigration and specifically our southern borders, right? So when we talk about expelling groups, our Mexican immigrants have been somebody, and anyone that is from south of the border, are people that we've consistently, as of recent history, been either deporting and or trying to keep from immigrating in this particular country under the framework of, well, they're taking our jobs or they're taking this. It's a threat to a specific opportunity, resource, economic, or social power that is creating this butt up against white supremacy in a way that is causing this settler colonialism framework to be administered again. And that's something, again, we'll talk about a lot when we get into the module on immigration. And then we also have Islamophobia, which is just the systemic marginalization of Muslims in this country. And it's again a link to those settler colonialistic mentalities and their links to Christianity. All right, we're almost there. This is a lot of information and it's a lot of theory. So take a breath, take a break if you need to. But I'm going to power through this last one and then get to it. Intersectionality is something that has been within feminist scholar frameworks for an extended period of time, but it is something that Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins specifically started having really distinct conversations about and are linked to. And then those have been continuously the people that have been talked about in reference to who coined this term and coined these ideas, though bits and pieces of them, again, have been talked about for a very extended period of time. And just intersectionality is really that idea that there's a concept that acknowledges that one cannot only have one identity at a time, and that the identities, along with their hierarchies, interact to create unique social positionality and social experiences. So I can't walk through this world as just a white person. I walk through this world as a white person who is also female, who is also cis female, who is also queer, who is also disabled, right? And none of those identities can I pick apart and just take away in any given moment. So when I engage in interactions with a particular institution, say we'll go with medical, I can't just go in there and interact as a white person. I have to go in there and interact as a white person who is female, who is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can't turn those off. And they create a unique set of circumstances that maybe another white male would go in there and have a very different set of circumstances. And he might also be disabled. It might also be queer, right? Might also be cis. But because he's male, he may have a different experience in that situation. And the reason for that might be that we have a difference of intersections of our identities, right? So while we have certain key things that are similar, there's certain intersections, specifically in this example, of our gender mixed with all of our other identities that have impacted this situation in different ways, right? And we'll get into that. And they talk about essentially the three big ones, the three things that we talk about the most, right? So we're going to talk about race or white supremacist society, which we talked about it again a minute ago. Then you have capitalism and patriarchy. And patriarchy is a system of gender oppression where men hold power and the central figures of the family, community, government, and larger society. And then capitalism, which is a system of class exploitation that produces wealth and income inequality through a profit-based system that maximizes profit for capitalists. And again, we talked about that a bit in some of our history lessons because capitalism is our core structure for which we operate economically at this juncture. And white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism are going to be intertwined, right? They're going to be inherently intertwined because specifically, capitalism took its main hold as a white male system of economic structure that shifted to continue to perpetuate wealth for white males, right? So these things are going to create that particular hierarchical structure, and it's going to create a system where certain people are going to have more political and economic power, right? We're going to keep getting back to that, that allow them the space to perpetuate their wealth, money, and power, right? They're going to keep that circle and cycle going. And again, we'll keep talking about how these three things interact with other institutions and other specific situations. And then we're going to talk about critical race theory. This is where I'm going to end this particular lecture, but we're going to talk about it real quick because it is something that has been this hot button random thing that has been latched onto in the media. And it's something that needs to kind of be addressed and needs to kind of be a very straightforward conversation as we talk about it in this class. Critical race theory is usually used in either the social sciences or law at a upper academic level. So you're going to see late high school all the way through your collegiate graduate levels, right? And it is a theory that centers the voices of people of color. It focuses on the eradication and not only just analysis of racist oppression, and requires reflexive thinking. It is an internal reflection of one's own positionality in the study of race, right? I talked about this when I did my very first positionality conversation before we even got into lectures. It's something that as we push forward and talk about our place in this system of oppression, of hierarchy, we also need to understand that our own position impacts how we study, how we learn, how we interpret information, what information has been given to us, what information we have to know to survive, what educational resources and opportunities have been there, et cetera, et cetera. And specifically, critical race theory allows the centering of people of color and their voices in regards to history, the consequences of history, and the ways these consequences are continued through a lack of critical reflection of that history, right? So it's not just, hey, this stuff happened. It's this stuff happened. These consequences were created both economically, structurally, socially, through excessive violence, and that is continued because we are lacking the conversations and the critical reflections needed to change how that trajectory and its consequences continue. All right. So if you have questions on this, or you have heard other things about critical race theory and you really want to hammer this out, this is a topic I will gladly take as many questions as possible. In fact, if you all want me to, shoot me an email and I will set up a specific thread in the discussion feeds on the Blackboard page so that you guys can just ask questions specifically about critical race theory if you want to. And that way we can have really open and honest conversations surrounding this topic, because I want there to be a very clear understanding of it in your brain, because essentially we are going to teach history not just from the view of white Eurocentric males, but we're going to teach history through all of history's perspective and through all of the people that it impacted, while also understanding how that history continues on. And we're going to, obviously that's a theme throughout this this course, and it's something that will continue to be important as we move forward through other topics. All right, so I hope you guys are having a great week, and we will talk again soon.